Welcome to the 188th program of the North Idaho College Public Forum. On behalf of the panel, it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome our guest, Mr. Charles Champlin. At this time, I would like to give you his background. As to present position, he is the entertainment art editor of the Los Angeles Times newspaper and has held that position since the year 1965. He is a graduate from Harvard, graduating with a bachelor's degree in English in 1948. He is certainly well known as an author, a journalist, and principal film critic for the Los Angeles Times. He has been on our campus this particular day to speak with our student body and has been most stimulating and informative about all aspects of his work. Mr. Champlin, it's a great pleasure to have you on our program.
Tony, it's very nice to be here. I must say I just had a good time trying to answer some questions, and I guess I'll try to answer a few more if anybody's got any.
We look forward to it very much. I also am happy to welcome three panel members. To my far left is one of our regular members, Mary Lou Reed. As to background, Mrs. Reed is a graduate with a bachelor's degree from Mills College. Following that, she attended graduate school at Columbia University in New York City in the field of religion or theology. Also to the panel this evening has come Jerry Jager, who is representing the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce and is in the position now as Vice President of Western Frontiers. And third, to my immediate left, is Janelle Burke, who has a bachelor's degree from the College of Idaho. She has a master's degree from the University of Indiana, and she served for 5 years as Dean of Women at Idaho State University. All three, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series of questions from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Mr. Champlin, can you tell us how you moved from the field of journalism into becoming a movie critic? Were you always a movie buff? Was this kind of a secret dream?
Well, always been a movie buff. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, a resort town. People would resort to almost anything to get away from it, as I've occasionally said. But I started, we had a little theater in those days, long since burned down, and my entry into show business was being allowed to pull the rope that opened the curtain. I suppose I was 7 or 8 years old. But unlike a lot of the people who are filmmakers and film critics now, I didn't always want to be a film critic. I've always wanted to be a writer. Since as early as I found out that I could play neither cornet nor shortstop, I decided that writing was what I should do. And it just so happened that I came out to Los Angeles to work for Time magazine in 1959 and began to do some movie stories around the industry. Then I went to London and was covering all of the arts for Time over there and began to do long interviews with people like David Lean and Tony Richardson and Julie Christie and Tom Courtney and people like that, John Schlesinger. And that led me to the Los Angeles Times, and when our film critic retired, I realized that without knowing it, I had spent a lot of time getting ready to be a film critic by learning about the industry, doing a lot of dealings around the world with actual news stories, which the movies get into these days. And so I guess what all that sums up as is luck.
You shared with the students your feelings about what it takes to be a movie critic, and perhaps you could pass that along to our viewers, the important points that a critic has to cover.
Sure. Well, I think in the first place, the critic is a writer. Any critic is first and foremost a writer with everything that means about being able to think logically and make judgments and express yourself coherently and grammatically and hopefully now and again with some kind of eloquence. Then I think the critic obviously has to have a thorough grounding in whatever his field is, have to have known where the movies have been in order to tell where they are and where they may still be going. And then finally, although it sounds trite, you have to love the medium, because in any medium, any form of art, there is always far more bad art, or maybe rising to mediocrity, than there is good art. And I think you have to have a certain kind of patience to get through all the bad art and to stay fresh enough to really appreciate the good art for what it is. And I think without that love of the medium, you don't have that kind of continuing hope that gets you through the bad ones.
Do you get a lot of mail? Do people write and say, I disagree with you, or I agree with you? What kind of chords do you strike in your readers?
I know from feedback, although it tends to be more in conversation that I'm read, I don't get as much mail as I would like. Usually, if people disagree with me, it's in terms of comments on my ancestry or various forms of degeneracy that people think they detect in me from either side of the political spectrum, in the middle, and so on and so forth. So there's not really enough dialogue, but when I get out and meet people and talk to them, I find that they they read and either agree or disagree.
Do you answer all those letters?
I answer every letter I get, absolutely. It takes all my weekends, but I figure if someone has taken the time to write me a thoughtful letter, I'll give them a thoughtful answer as best I can.
That's
Sure.
commendable.
Yeah.
Mr. Jaeger.
Good. Thank you, Tony. First of all, I must mention to you that when Tony called me to discuss this program, he mentioned that I would be discussing the film industry with Charles Chaplin. And I jumped up and I said, Tony, I don't know much about the movies. I said, but I'm not going to miss a chance to see Charlie Chaplin.
Ah, yes, I get that all the time. My grandfather, my father, whatever. I met Chaplin once. I got to interrupt to tell you that. And he was when he was making A Countess from Hong Kong, his last film in London, and I was there on my way from the Cannes Festival, I guess, and we were introduced by a mutual friend who was working on the film, and he said, Mr. Chaplin, this gentleman's name is much like yours. And Chaplin very nicely said, oh, really? How is yours spelled? And for the moment, I couldn't remember. I said, oh, mine is C-H-A. We did fight, and then he had to go off and do another take.
Very good.
It was fun.
Does he always walk that way?
He was walking rather slowly now. He was already quite an elderly man.
I must ask you a question. If you walk into the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas, you feel like you're walking into another age, certainly at least another age of the movie industry. You see the film strips of Humphrey Bogart and Edward G. Robinson and those kinds of people. And I've often heard that referred to as the golden age of the movies. How does that compare with today's movie industry, financially, in terms of the art involved and so forth?
Well, that certainly was the golden age. From a standing start in roughly 1900, I mean, the movies, let's say by the early 40s, were a multi-billion-dollar industry. They had an extraordinary influence on the consciousness and the tastes of people all over the world, because probably 90% of the films shown on screens any place in the world before the Second World War were from America. And the star system, the studios were integrated from the lowliest writers up to the starriest stars with their fabulous salaries by way of everything. And the technicians, unmatched in their time, could give you all of ancient Rome from a bucket of sand and a little plaster of Paris. It was a wonderful time, and it ended in 1946 when daily television began, because from that moment the movies were o'erthrown as the medium of entertainment. The major studios lost their economic base. They also got into an antitrust action which forced them to divest the theaters, which had given them a kind of captive audience for their product no matter how bad it was. They was always assured of some minimal return on any turkey that they made. They could just run it through their own theaters. And in those days there was an automatic audience that went to see everything. That all changed. The steady audience has, for the movies, has probably declined by 80%, something from 100 million tickets a week to maybe 20 million tickets a week. The major studios, except for Universal, have no contract player at all. Metro, speaking of the Grand Hotel, had all of those stars under contract. The birthday party picture of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 1944 is just every star in Hollywood, from James Stewart to Harry James to Judy Garland to everyone. And now Metro has no one under contract. The last person they had under contract was Chad Everett for a television series. And so it goes throughout the industry. Now they keep solvent after a fashion by selling television, producing for television. But that day is over. The movies have changed forever. The age will never come back. The major studios with their glamour and all of it are gone forever. We can lament it. I think there have been ironic consolations, of which the greatest is simply that the movies, having lost their steady audience and taken a minority position among the art forms, mass entertainment forms anyway, have found a freedom of expression that they never had before, so that it's a corny thing to say, but the best films, fewer they may be, nevertheless, in my view, are better than ever.
What is the greatest movie of all time?
Well, I think it depends on whether you're in the mood for Casablanca or in the mood for Citizen Kane. I think probably that the greatest American movie is probably Citizen Kane, for both its technical innovation and for the fact that it touches us. I mean, it's also a humanist document. When Rosebud goes up in the flames at the end of Citizen Kane, you care for the wasted life that Charles Foster Kane has led, I think, and that's why it touches you both cerebrally and emotionally. I watched Casablanca again the other Sunday afternoon on television for maybe the 20th time. And as a classic example of the Hollywood romantic melodrama with a sort of daring creativity that we wouldn't attempt now, I think, that's also a great film, but probably that's great of a kind, and I think Citizen Kane is probably the most adventurous film that we've ever made in this country.
Janelle Burt.
Earlier in your presentation, very interesting and entertaining presentation to the students at North Idaho College, you talked about a brief history of American films, the film industry, particularly beginning with the melting pot tradition. And I wondered if you might like to comment on some of the significant factors in the development of the American film industry.
Well, I think that, again, that's a hard question to answer in anything like a short time, but what is first and foremost interesting is with what extraordinary rapidity the industry developed. And from 1896, when the first movies were able to be projected onto a screen, there had been sort of flip card, bioscope things, penny arcade, Nickelodeon machines. They started being projected in 1896, which is obviously just, what, 80 years ago. And yet by 1910, there were 10,000 cinemas in this country. It had become the mass medium of entertainment for the working class primarily. It had much more to do with vaudeville and music hall than it did with the legitimate stage. Early days, I mean, there were movies, one-reelers, a couple of them would be shown on vaudeville bills in music halls. And the Warner Brothers started with a little kind of a vaudeville stroke movie house in, I think, Ohio, in which they showed a couple of one-reelers, and then Jack Warner, then a boy soprano, sang accompanied by his sister on the piano to chase out the customers so that they could seat another audience for the same two-reelers. But by 1926, which was sort of a peak of theater building in this country, there were 20,000 cinemas in the United States. There are now something like 13,000. But it grew with extraordinary rapidity. The genius, the accidental genius, I suppose, of the founding moguls, the Zuckers and the Mayers and the Warners, took this infant form, and you have to remember that it was both an infant industry and an infant art form. I mean, in a sense, in the lifetimes of many of us, we have been able to watch the grammar of the movies develop, and we are still in the presence of the men who literally invented the movies as a telling medium. I mean, Hitchcock still making movies, and one of the men who helped discover what the movies could say and how they could say it, and others, Fritz Lang, like him, and so on. But the Moguls, these gamblers, these men out of the ghettos of Middle Europe and Russia and Poland who came to find a new prosperity and new hope and a new life in this country, did, and they created a new industry, and they built it from the ground up so that it was suddenly integrated, as I was saying earlier, from the writers through the stars, the production capability, the theaters, the distribution. They were wholesalers, retailers, they were everything, and it became a monumental industry, at first I think dedicated almost exclusively to our diverting entertainment, increasingly finding, however, that they had power to do classic stories and power to deal with social issues. I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, Public Enemy and all the other gangster films, Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, The Curies, all of the film biographies, the film as an incredible device for opening up history, or at least a kind of history, at least into the popular imagination. And they found these almost, well, I would say unlimited powers that the film had, because even now, I don't think we know where ultimately the films are going. I mean, I think of all the art forms, the movies are still the one that hasn't yet discovered all its parameters, you might say, and you still go to the movies with some sense that you're going to see something you've never seen before. And obviously since '46, as I was saying, the movies have changed drastically, but they have finally found an ultimate freedom of expression, so that now there is nothing, for better and for worse, that the movies can't say or show or treat of. And that's very important, and you have to judge any art form by its highest achievements and its greatest expectations. And I think in that sense, the movies are really coming to some ironic flowering amidst a certain kind of economic chaos, you know. But does that possibly answer some of your question?
Yes, it does.
Sure. Okay.
Mr. Chaplin, I want to move into an area with you that has not been discussed by anyone today with you, and may I preface it by saying that I'm taking advantage of your presence with us. I admire very much your ability to interpret the motion picture industry. My first question is dealing with our society in general, in which we have had a history in our country of, as far as blacks are concerned, or women, or American natives, and many other groups, of being outside the mainstream of decision-making in politics, in the church, etc. It appears to me that the first industry or the first institution in our country to bring about a change in the role of women and blacks and so forth has been the movie industry. And I'd like to get your comments. Have they been instrumental in bringing those persons into our life by first introducing them in the role of actors and actresses in the movie industry?
Yeah, I think so, certainly, very, very strongly. I think that the movies in their time were the greatest ameliorating, is that the word I want? Ameliorating influence, introducing us to each other, helping us to understand each other, not necessarily on a conscious or deliberate basis necessarily, but just almost inevitably reflecting something about the society around us, whether they were telling fairy tales off of the society or whatever. But certainly I think that's true, that the movies have been an extraordinary force for opening up, for establishing cultural norms, cultural aspirations, and I think for more recently, I think, beginning to look at problems with a little more depth. I think that it's curious, I mean, you mentioned women. I think that the whole subject of women in the movies has been touched with irony, because in the days of the Golden Age and the great female stars, women were treated with a kind of reverence. They were not often, but sometimes achievers. I mean, they were Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford in their tailored suits, running companies, somehow in the last frame always quite willing to be led away from it all by Cary Grant, but for the moment at least eager to be achievers and indeed functioning as achievers. And the irony is, I guess, that as the movies have changed and opened up under the new ratings, that, well, Molly Haskell in her book about women on film called it From Reverence to Rape, because that's exactly the way the progression went. And having this new power to be candid about women, it has suggested all the things that have been wrong with women's lives in the society. I think it's strange even now that the movies have not done more to suggest the changing consciousness of women, the changing roles of women in the society. It's been done a little, but Hollywood, as a commercial enterprise, still seems to be in the captivity of what I call the pal ship films, Butch Cassidy and all of the paling imitations that have come along since. And although you've had Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore and Women Under the Influence and so on and so forth, I think the movies have a long way to go to really feed back to us what is happening with women in the society. It's because the movies are always a mirror of the society, but they're oftentimes a very delayed action mirror for lots of reasons: timidity, social acceptance, so on and so forth, so that what's happening in the society often finds expression 5 to 10 to 20 years later, I think, and they'll catch up with women sooner or later, and I think not a moment too soon. Blacks have fared much better. I think that the movies are a marketplace commodity, and when it became clear that there was a lively and underexploited market, black market for films, Hollywood rushed in with some films that were exploitational, vulgar, gross, and so on, and other films that one way or another really did reflect and expand on the black experience in this country, because traditionally, except in occasional fairly recent films that always starred Sidney Poitier, there were relatively few portrayals of blacks that were, I mean, sometimes they were sympathetic, but they were often stereotypes, servants, comic servants, maybe reflecting some earlier period of subservience in the society, but never really reflecting that there were black achievers in the society. Now there are films which I think come closer to reflecting the whole diversity of the black experience. And also what black films seem to be doing is running through all of the white forms in black. I mean, the black Western, the black private eye, the black adventure. And in Mahogany, which was one of the most successful films of last year, the black romantic melodrama, which had its many white counterparts in the 30s and 40s, except that it now starred Diana Ross and Billy D. Williams instead of, well, let's say Lana Turner and somebody, Stuart Granger or whoever, Randolph Scott. And now it's very successful because it's same message of, I think, romantic idealism, found acceptance now as it did in the 30s and 40s. And also now, what is very healthy, I think, for the society is that so many of the, particularly the better black films, are reaching what they call a crossover audience. In other words, something like 40% of the audiences for Mahogany have been white. And I think that, again, as a tool of social introduction or amelioration, that the movies have a great deal of power. But of course, so does television. I mean, television is probably even more pervasive these days.
May I ask one more question before going to the panel that relates to that? And that is, quite often one, in their own limited experience as my own, I will be with individuals who are observing movies and that I describe as having a very important social message, for example, in Heat of the Night, again with the racial issues. And while viewing that movie with those individuals, they will identify very much with those that are oppressed and be very angry with the villains in the movie and so forth. But yet in their daily lives, one notes that quite often they go back to a behavior pattern of really playing much the role of, in a more limited way, of the villain. In other words, I am asking you, are those social messages getting through to the citizens, or do they temporarily identify with the theme that the producer and the writers are attempting to get across?
Well, you know, that whole question of the influence the movies or television have on us is mischievous and hard to say with any assurance, because if you say, well, the movies are having a very positive effect in terms of social attitudes, then you say, well, the movies have power, therefore they're also having an effect with all their violence and so on, or all their sex, and what are they doing on actual behavior. And I find very little credible information on how the movies affect behavior in terms of either sexual conduct or in terms of violent conduct. And I can, in good conscience, say that I think that the movies turn around and have a positive influence in other areas. Because, it's the same question. I simply don't know. I suspect that the process of education that comes out of the movies or off of television takes a fairly long time, and I think it's fairly subtle. I think that, for example, years ago, we ran an article in the paper from a psychiatrist saying that the problem with violence, and I don't mean to divert from your question, I want to answer it, but the problem with violence on television or in the movies was the constant iteration of an implied lesson that only violence solves problems. And the danger was not that people wanted to go out and do a specific kind of violence, but just almost some finally subconscious response in the audience that, yes, only violence solves problems, that it's impossible for reasonable men to sit down and talk out a problem, and that you always have to have a shootout or a punch-up or whatever it is. And I think that's dangerous, but I find that a very persuasive kind of argument. On the other hand, it does seem to me some sort of common sense tells you that over a long period of time, when you have a series of movies which accept, let's say, blacks as comprehensible, believable, credible figures, sympathetic, so on, and the same of any other group, ethnic or political or otherwise, that must have some influence ultimately. I think that there's a whole question about the overt messages of films, the explicit messages of films, and it's fairly explicit in The Heat of the Night, for example, and all of the less explicit, the implicit, the inferable message that movies give, sometimes when they don't intend to. I mean, I think movies always do give messages. I don't think there's any question about that. And part of the thing that is a little bit befuddling to critics sometimes is that they must sort out what those messages really are. To take a different kind of message movie, let us say, Midnight Cowboy, the first X-rated film to get an Oscar. Well, what is that film about homosexuality? Is it about homosexual prostitution? Or is it ultimately about the possibility of some sort of charity, humanist concern existing among people even in the grimy depths of modern society? Well, the fact that Midnight Cowboy was honored by the National Catholic Motion Picture Conference and the National Council of Churches and Jewish groups suggests that there were a lot of people who could see that movie and understand that its ethical message was finally very traditional, and whatever the language was and whatever the specific behavior was, that finally it was a morality play, because the Midnight Cowboy obviously had recognized tragically at the end of that film how wrong all of his assumption had been about life and the lifestyle he had chosen and so on. So that is the message there, even in the context of an X-rated film. And I think that in the 30s, obviously the American films gave messages of material aspiration, material wants, which may have been mischievous in the long run because they paid too little attention to other kinds of spiritual wants and maybe failed to suggest that material aspirations might have built-in limitations or frustrations of a certain kind. So that I think that the process by which films and television work on us are very subtle, and it's dangerous to be too dogmatic about what they are doing. But I think when movies speak to traditional values, when they speak, as in even in the disaster films, when they suggest that people are still capable of heroic self-sacrifice, and self-sacrifice independent of any considerations of ethnic background. I mean, you can, so on. I think that that's all to the good, and I think that we are, I hope, left better by the movies and television for those reasons, yeah.
Mary Reed.
Well, since you've touched on violence and message, could you say something about Rollerball and what sort of significance a film like that has? And in the audience reaction?
Well, Rollerball, of course, was that very interesting Norman Jewison film about a future society in which there apparently is no war, but national destinies are decided by some kind of huge new sort of roller skating game which involves fatalities and so on and so forth. I thought it was an interesting conception for a film. I happen to like the film quite a lot. It did use a lot of violence, although I think its view of violence was intended to horrify the audience rather than please them or thrill them. And it was a film sketching certain possible dangers out of the growth of the multinational corporations, because at this point in the film, or in this point in the film's view of the world, the multinational corporations have in fact replaced nations as the rulers of the world, so that it's a parable about the multinational corporation and about the rising exploitation of violence in sports in our society. And I think that it presumably relates to soccer violence and pop bottles or beer bottles thrown at Pete Rose and so on and so forth. Now, I think the question that you have to ask about Rollerball is whether it works with the audience.
That was really the question.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think,
cheering.
did people get those lessons out of Rollerball? Did they take the message about multinational corporations? Did they come away concerned by the growth and power of multinational corporations? I think in all kind of candor, with due respect, I would have to say probably not, that it was seen as a violent action picture, and that was all. I mean, on the one hand, you give them credit for not making the message maybe too explicit and dogmatic and dull. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it really did get to the audience. So I would say, no, I really don't feel so.
Well, I asked the question because I was horrified more by the audience than
horrified by the audience reaction.
Yes.
Sure.
They got right into the spirit of things.
Yeah.
And what is the responsibility of the movie filmmaker when he is dealing with this explosive subject? If he misses his mark, is he not really playing with fire?
Sure. Well, there again, there's your outreach. What is the specifically violent outreach of a movie? Is there any behavioral payoff that these movies engender? I don't know. I think that was rated R, which suggested a prudent attitude, at least in the rating administration, that it should not be seen by the very young. I don't know whether we know really what violence on the screen does to people. Does it sicken them, or does it set up imitative behavior? I don't think there's much evidence of that, except in the occasional psychopath who would be as likely triggered by a brush from a policeman on the street or something like that. But it does raise problems. I mean, and particularly in some directors who seem to be having it both ways. Now, I give Norman Jewison personal credit for being very concerned about the issues which were raised in that film. Sam Peckinpah is a man who has made a career on dealing with violence. Sam Peckinpah has obvious ideas about violence. I mean, he has, I think, very simplistic notions about the love of violence that we have in us, and he's commenting on it. And I think he has simplistic notions about violence as a rite of passage to manhood, which I think is a nefarious and foolish idea. But he is dealing with those ideas, and you have to recognize in his films that he is. On the other hand, if you see The Wild Bunch with a paying audience, you hear those war whoops as they're watching the film. I mean, it's obviously getting them. Now, where it leaves them at the end of the movie, it would take some kind of depth analysis to tell. I think that it was impossible for any reasonably sane person to leave The Wild Bunch without feeling absolutely spent and wanting nothing so much as not even see Band-Aids for a while, you know, let alone blood or violence. And there probably is some truth to the Aristotelian notion of purging influence of violence.
Tony, can I push this just
Certainly.
one step further to ask how you feel about documentary violence such as Hearts and Minds, which was covered Vietnam? Do you feel that this is responsible and effective and perhaps a product of television? Is it a new kind of movie?
Well, I think that television's coverage, not necessarily because Hearts and Minds finally was after the fact a bit, I think, but I think television's coverage of the Vietnam War was a major factor in turning public opinion around, or perhaps just mobilizing public opinion against our continuing involvement in Vietnam. And I think that the violence has shown the killing, the destruction of a country which didn't have that much to destroy was very effective. And I think that, you know, television has this power, this immediacy to show what the real world is like. And I think, you know, it ought to. I certainly can think of no reasons for it's not, and I think that it may, by making the full implications of war, you know, inescapable in the living room. Why not? I think that's a very valuable social function.
Jerry Jager.
Thank you. My son and daughter are very avid moviegoers. However, Jennifer is only 8 years old and JJ is only 5, so therefore there's a substantial number of movies that are restricted to them.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about who rates the movies and the criteria that they use to rate them.
Sure. Okay. Well, the rating administration, it's called CRA, the Code and Rating Administration. It's a function of the Motion Picture Association, which Jack Valenti runs. It is presently headed by an academic, sociologist, historian from Rutgers named Richard Hefner, who has a staff of, I think, about a dozen professional people who assign the ratings. They're from a cross-section. There are men and women. There's a psychologist. There's a former journalist. And so they represent ages, backgrounds, geography even. And it's a consensus system in which they either vote the same way after they've seen a film, or if they disagree about it, they may screen it again, or whatever. It's a successor firm, you might say, to the Breen office, which administered the Hays Code, and it's obviously a voluntary self-regulation by the industry in the hope of forestalling any larger imposition of government censorship. The thing as it was arranged is different now because it involves the active participation of the National Association of Theater Owners, who agree to police their box office and keep those under 17 out of R-rated films and those under 18 out of X-rated films. And as I can tell, it's effective enough to make a difference in the box office. For example, Jaws was rated PG. I thought that was disgraceful. I thought it was should have been an R-rated picture, because it seemed to me that it was likely to scare particularly very young children, because other young children were being jeopardized by the shark in the film, and I think that children are most susceptible to violence done on other children. They don't care what happens to adults. I don't even think they listen to adults on the screen, but they care what happens to kids, and they listen to kids. The estimates I've heard from other people around the industry that if Jaws had been rated R, it might have costed $50 million at the box office, because it makes that much difference in terms of parental choices not to take their kids or let their kids see R-rated films. There's a lot of flexibility built into the system, so that what is a PG now might have been an R some time ago, or vice versa. It's an inexact science, certainly, but presumably the violence and the nudity or whatever are much less explicit in the PG category, which is a warning for parents that there may be some material that's unsuited for the immature, or for young teenagers perhaps. R obviously has much wider parameters in terms of explicit violence, in terms of language, and in terms of nudity and sexual behavior. And then R is at that line where presumably the law and taste might come together to agree that the contents of an X-rated film might be legally actionable as being, sort of obscene or pornographic or whatever, or actionable in terms of being seen by people who are under the age of 18. The problem category is PG, and there are many complaints about the latitudes of language and violence that are in the PG category. The ratings, interestingly enough, as a whole, I think are much more sensitive to sex, nudity, than they are to violence. I mean, it reflects a society which continues to be much more uptight about sex than it is about violence. And I think that the change that's going on at the moment is, I think the raters are understanding that people are much more sensitive about language than anyone thought they were. And the complaints I hear, oddly enough, are as much about language in films now as they are about sex or violence. People are just very tired of all that four-letter or participial phrases thereof. And I think that the ratings themselves, however, to their credit, are getting stricter about violence. They're getting tougher on violence. They have now rated at least a couple of films X just for violence without sex. A couple of kung fu films, Street Fighter, which are very violent, super violent films, and they've gotten X ratings, which I think is a very healthy sign for the society.
Janelle Burke.
In terms of censorship, I wonder if you might compare the Hays Code with the present code, say some ways in which the Hays Code probably influenced the making of films during that period, leading to perhaps, say, the Andy Hardy films.
Sure, a very good question. The Hays Code, which was, I think, actually written in about 1930 and put into force in 1934, it really kind of codified the American dream, really. It imposed a vision. I mean, it was a series of, essentially, of don'ts. You can't do this, you can't deal with that, you can't say that. But under an umbrella, kind of was suggested that we did live in an optimistic, God-centered world. As I said this morning, the Judeo-Christian tradition is enhanced by free enterprise, unlimited, and representative democracy. And the crime specifically could not be glorified or condoned or go unpunished. Moral transgressions had to be punished. In the end, no one could get away with either a moral or criminal transgression. And some sort of scorekeeping had to be done in the last reel, often fairly arbitrarily. But it did produce, despite the limitations, any number of obviously classic, wonderful films, all of which reiterated this vision of life. And I think that it had a lot of influence. I think that those of us who grew up maybe had some relearning to do. I find that after 30 years as a journalist, I think my instinct is always that the good guy is going to win. Life has told me that the good guy does not always win, but somehow I was conditioned by the movies to think that he would, and many other kinds of conditioning. Some of them mischievous, like what the nature of romance was and what the romantic partner ought to be like. And I think that you had some lessons of plastic beauty to overcome and some lessons to learn about interior values to be cherished in people. But in any event, that was the rating system, and it had those effects, and it produced a certain kind of film for a long time in which the good guys, if they didn't win, they didn't do any worse than break even. The philosophy of the new system is obviously much different. The Valenti ratings understand that that old audience doesn't exist anymore, that old undivided monolithic mass audience no longer exists. It's gone to television, and that the movies therefore no longer have either the possibility of reaching that audience or the necessity to tailor to it. In other words, in those days under the Hays Code, everything was G-rated, and everybody went to all the movies. That no longer exists. There are now audiences for films. The filmmaker faced a fractionated audience, and the ratings said that there had to be some way that his new role could be accommodated, and it was to try to adjust the rights of the filmmaker for freedom of expression with the rights of the society to be forewarned that not all movies were now made for all people, and that some movies were going to be sterner than others. The whole sense of the ratings is to put the responsibility on the filmmaker, say that we're not going to tell you what you can't do, but we hope you will use your own judgment on how you use this freedom. And a lot of the most noisome films, you might call them, that are made now actually have nothing to do with the rating system. I mean, the hardcore stuff is all off there someplace. It has nothing to do with mainstream commercial filmmaking. And but the ratings warn the society, warn parents specifically, that there are going to be films now that are thus and so, and that are hardest. And I think it's been, you know, they've, as Mayor LaGuardia once said, he didn't make many mistakes, but when he did, it's a beaut, you know. And I think the ratings have made relatively few mistakes over the 2,500 films which have now been rated. But the ones that they have, I think, misrated have been oftentimes very noisome. I think that perhaps in its time, Ryan's Daughter should have been an R instead of a PG. And I think that True Grit, for example, was much too violent to be G-rated. I think there are the rattlesnake business and knives and so on. I think it should have been PG. I think Jaws should have been rated R as a way of just simply telling parents that this is too heavy for really small children. Now, I may have been wrong, but as a parent and grandparent, that was my perception of Jaws. But on the whole, I think the ratings have accommodated the need of the movies to open up creatively. And I think they have fairly protected the society from what it might find distasteful to go see.
In response to Mr. Jager's question, you made the point that it seems that many of the American people react much more quickly to sex in movies than violence, and in censorship committees that have existed in some of our smaller towns, this has been the case. Would you care to elaborate upon what causes many groups of people who are interested in censorship to do this? What kind of conditioning has taken place to cause them to be so much more strongly opposed to sex and violence in movies?
Yeah, well, I think I know why people are relatively indifferent to violence. I mean, it's partly the fact that it has been a violent society, not that far away from the frontier. I mean, it's just newly come to some totally settled civilization. But I think also, and probably more important actually, is the fact that from the beginning the movies were action and conflict plus action equals violence. And violence has been a staple of the movies since the Great Train Robbery in 1903, which sometimes begins and sometimes ends, and sometimes both begins and ends with a shot of a man firing a shot directly into the camera lens. And I think that the movies have used violence just because it was ideal for motion pictures. And I think that then as the Hays Code, reflecting the uptightness of an earlier society about sexual matters, was proscribed from dealing with sex in any shape or form except of warm waves breaking over rocks or something like that, and even then a little dangerously, violence became a kind of proxy or substitute for sex. But I think there was also always a kind of screen convention of violence, of make-believe violence, in which it was violent, although it was a kind of denatured violence. I mean, you never, until Peckinpah came along, you never really saw the shirt tear or the blood spurt from the sawn neck and so on and so forth. It was all, even the image of the firing was in a different frame from the image of the hit, so that there was some sort of divorce of the action and the effect. And I think there was also a presumption sort of that the cowboys had the big shootout in the dusty main street in front of the Long Branch Saloon, and then a whistle blew and they all got up and dusted themselves off and went off to the commissary for chicken salad sandwiches at lunch. And I think in some way, consciously or unconsciously, as audiences, we were reassured by knowing that death was not permanent but only an action. I mean, as kids practicing the dying falls of the shot cowboy in the backyard, I grew up doing that, and so did almost everybody I know. So that it was not understood it was understood not to be really violent violence. And I think that the classic instance of the confusion came with Bonnie and Clyde when, as you probably remember, Joe Morgenstern of Newsweek first reviewed it as being simply another exploitational use of violence, and then came back the next week and said, no, it was a masterpiece because it did understand that killing kills and violence hurts. And I think that's the difference now in the violence, that it is much more graphic and it's understood to be permanent, and somehow we accept it as being much more horrifying because it's no longer make-believe. Well, but I think that the confusion in the society probably is still relating back to that kind of tradition of make-believe violence. But it's still true that the society is unevenly reconciled to certain changes in mores that have obviously been going on on an evolutionary way for years and years in this country. And I think I've always thought and said that it was significant that the first Kinsey report on sexual behavior in the human male was published in 1948, already reflecting 25 years of reporting on a gradual change in sexual mores specifically. And yet in 1948, the movies were still 20 years away from allowing Clark Gable to say anything more than, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, or suggesting that love and sex existed in the same context. So that I think that, as I say, it just reflects society, for various reasons, is still uptight about the sexual side of life. I think it's ironic that the movies, having dealt with love without sex for 40 years, then turned around and gave us a few years of sex without love, and now I think they're trying once again to sort of, or trying at least, to put it all together. I don't know, I've said that, you know, and this is really off the subject, but the movies in marriage, you know, they used to say that they lived happily ever after, and every film ended with somebody about to start living happily ever after. And then when the movies opened up under the new ratings, they suddenly said, you'll be very lucky to get through the weekend, you know. So that's where they still are, I guess.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, in its infancy, the movie industry, in addition to having action and violence and Western, had comedy. And we had those wonderful silent Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. And what do you think has happened to comedy? Are we still having funny films? And are we laughing at the same
I
thing?
think people probably find it harder to find the world funny. But I think that essentially what happened was that television went to comedy. Comedy went to television, I mean, and television went to comedy, as a matter of fact. I think that the very best comedy is now done on television. I don't think you could find better comedy than the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I just think that the Mary Tyler Moore Show knows everything that Howard Hawks and all the great filmmakers of the 30s and early 40s knew about making comedy. Timing and just a sort of a whole brio, marvelous style. And I think that the films, have lost their great comics. I mean, Jerry Lewis is probably the last of the great performing comics to make movies. Woody Allen is essentially a verbal comedian, although he tries to be physical sometimes. But television, just because it's easier, it's more suitable for the living room, that a lot of both the creators and potential performers of comedy are on television. I think that's why. I think the movies are desperately anxious to get back into television. I mean, the success of the Mel Brooks films and the success of Gene Wilder's Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother suggests that there is a thirsty audience for comedy out there. I think the problem at the moment is to try to find people who can write it and direct it and perform it. I think it's amazing. I don't know if you saw The Return of the Pink Panther. It's a very amusing film in a kind of mechanical way, but it's just made an extraordinary amount of money. I think beyond whatever its merits are, simply because it has no competition or almost none in the marketplace. So that I presume that over the next few years, you're going to see more film comedy because people want to laugh, need to escape from the rigors of the real world more. But it fell into a decline like the family film did simply because it was on television. And then there was a decline of people who could do it well. But it'll come back.
What about those wonderful little British, like Lavender Hill Mob? And there was a period when there were these very sophisticated kinds of humorists. Do you think television is producing anything like that?
Yes, well, Monty Python doesn't quite make it, does it? I just don't know. It's one of the miraculous things, how these things surface and then disappear again. I mean, there was this wonderful flowering of what they call the Ealing comedies, all of those that you've mentioned and others. And then, for some reason, it just all changed. And Peter Sellers went on to other things, who was one of the stars, and Guinness did other things. And I guess, I mean, why it should have flowered and failed is a mystery. I don't really know. It's like anything else in life. I guess it's all cyclical. Who knows?
Jerry Jager.
Good. One of the hats that I'm wearing today, Mr. Champlin, is that of the Coeur d'Alene Area Chamber of Commerce. I would like to talk about our economy for just a minute. A film that's appearing in Coeur d'Alene right now is called The Winds of Autumn. It was filmed in the Flathead Lake area in Montana. Not too long ago, a film called Breakheart Pass with Charles Bronson was in our town, and it was filmed in Lewiston, which is not very far south of us here in Idaho. What could a community like ours do to maybe attract a film company here? I know you've been real busy since you've been in Coeur d'Alene. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of the beauty of our area and all. And is there anything we can do?
Well, I think all you've got to do, in the first instance at least, is let people know you're here and that you're willing to be cooperative with filmmakers. Obviously, there is a great, the rising sophistication of the audience has made it more and more necessary to go out and do films on locations. You can't fool people with painted sets in the back lot or with rear process projection and so on and so forth. I think that many states now, I don't know about Idaho, but certainly New Mexico and Arizona, and Colorado, I know, both have very active state film commissions existing solely to help film companies spot locations and solve all the other logistical problems that they have. And it's paid off handsomely for New Mexico, I know, and for Colorado. And as I say, whether Montana and Idaho have state film commissions, I don't know, but that's the level at which you should start, because any one community, chances are, might not have all the resources of scenery or whatever that a filmmaker wanted. But I think that, you know, ads in the trade papers and solicitations to the various production companies in Hollywood, just to know that you're here, that, you know, I don't know whether there are tax concessions or whatever it is, or simply brochures pointing out that you've got you know, sand dunes or mountains or trees or water or white water rivers, whatever, just so that when they start to do something like Breakheart Pass, that the production manager, who is always usually the location spotter, has an idea that maybe he better check out Coeur d'Alene or Spokane or Kellogg or wherever it is for whatever he wants. And the people down there should just know that they will be welcomed, and that there'll be help with, let's say, extras or with accommodations or whatever. I think you'll find no trouble luring people to come up here. And as a matter of fact, there's been a recent contract settlement with the craft unions in Hollywood, which is over the next 3 years going to increase the salaries and the costs, what they call below the line, that is the technical production costs, something like 53%. And I suspect, although I love Hollywood, I suspect that there's going to be another trend toward the kind of runaway production that did great damage to Hollywood some years ago when everybody was running off to do westerns in Yugoslavia or Almeria, Spain, or places like that. And whereas I don't know that there's that much future in attracting runaway production, I think that you will find great interest, sympathetic interest in Hollywood if there are productions that they can do here and be sure that they can make their films efficiently and cut their costs that way.
When we get our film, be sure to give us a good review.
Well, of course, how can I not, you know?
Janelle Burke.
One of the things that have changed along with films, since they are now in competition with TV, is the fact that more individuals are making films rather than major film studios. And I wondered if you might like to comment on this movement toward...
Sure. Well, in general, I think the process that's happened in Hollywood is what I call a kind of an emulsifying of the old power structures. The major studios, the major distributors, the major theater chains, and so on, have all somewhat tended to break into smaller concentrations of power. And certainly, as the major studios, let's say, which used to make and distribute 50 to 60 films a year each through their own distribution systems, are now perhaps producing in their own right maybe half a dozen to a dozen films, and perhaps buying a half a dozen others from, you know, existing resources, that is, films that were made independently. It does suggest that there's a much greater opportunity for independently financed films to be distributed independently. I mean, Hester Street, which was shown here this week, is a film that was made on private money entirely outside the industry and distributed by the man and wife who made the film, being distributed themselves, completely outside any distribution system, and it will be very successful for them, I think. But whether you want to distribute the film yourself or just make it, I think the time has never been better for the independent filmmaker to get a film made. And there's a lot of venture capital around, a lot of risk capital that's eager to get into the movie business, because although 9 out of 10 movies lose money, that 10th movie makes an extraordinary amount of money, and the multiples on investment are very, very great, so that there is risk capital available, and a lot of tax shelter money has been available. In fact, tax shelter money probably saved the life of Columbia Studios, which is $160 million in debt, managed to finance some films with tax shelter capital, and is now reducing its debt, and it seems to be in a nice condition of solvency. But in a sense, it's a very good time to be involved creatively in films, because there are opportunities. You're not entirely at the mercy of 5 or 6 or 7 major films.
Somewhat differently, what do you look for in really an extraordinary film? As a critic, what makes a film extraordinary for you?
Well, I think, this sounds like an evasive answer, but you first have to figure out what the intentions of the film are, and obviously some intentions are more interesting than others, like Bergman's Cries and Whispers is a different kind of intention from doing a shoot-'em-up Western, so that you look for the intention which tries to push out the boundaries, the frontiers of film. And then obviously the crucial question is, how well did the intention succeed? I mean, there are avant-garde films that fall flat on their blurring images, and there are other films which try to leap ahead and which successfully do. I don't think there's any one kind of film that you can look for, but as I said earlier, film is still a kind of undiscovered bourne and undiscovered terrain, and you're really most excited, I think, to see the films that push against the limits of what film can do, and which try to get away from what films have done well before. And you find that in a film like Cuckoo's Nest, which just seems to me to represent a different kind of social condition. I don't think spectacle is ahead for us in terms of real excitement now. I think it's the internal spectacle that is interesting, the films that seem to get deeper into the dark recesses of the human soul.
Do you want to have an involvement with the major characters? Or with a character in the film?
By and large. I mean, it may not even be a sympathetic involvement, but I think that you want to know where people are. And I think that the thing that the movies do most successfully for us is introduce us to each other. And I think, without getting to be Pollyannish about it, I think we look for the films to give us some kind of reassurance about the nature of the human condition and the perfection of the human individual, perhaps.
With that, I'm going to have to bring our program to conclusion. And on behalf of the panel, I'm sure I can say to you, Mr. Champlin, that I'm sorry we do not have 2 more hours so we could pursue so many more questions. You have been extremely informative to our student body and to our viewing audience, and we thank you very much.
Well, Tony, it's just been a lot of fun to be here, and I wish we had a couple more hours, too. Thank you very much.
I thank the panel again for outstanding questions. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at 6 o'clock on Channel 7. We'll be interviewing another personality. And until that time, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by Videotape Recording.